What if I told you that the most dangerous threat to a perfect marriage isn't an affair, but a gift? A generous, life-altering gift, wrapped in love and presented with the best of intentions. It sounds crazy, I know. But I'm telling you this because I lived it. Our fortress, the one Tom and I had built over a decade, was nearly brought down by an act of kindness. It all started on the day we came home, believing our perfect life was unshakable. The air in our house still held the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine we'd planted by the window, a stark contrast to the diesel and spice-laden air of Bangkok we'd been breathing for the last 2 months. Jet lag was a thick blanket over my senses, but it was a comfortable weight. Tom dropped our dusty backpacks by the door, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet of our home. "I'll never get tired of this feeling," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Leaving is great. But coming home?" He didn't need to finish. I leaned against him, feeling the familiar strength of his frame. Our house wasn't just a structure of wood and plaster, it was a museum of our choices. A vibrant Peruvian tapestry covered one wall of the living room, a story in every thread. A Moroccan lamp threw dappled light across the floor, bought in a Marrakech souk after an hour of haggling in broken French. Every object was a passport stamp, a memory of a life lived on our own terms, a life consciously, deliberately, and joyfully built for two. This was the masterpiece we had created together. We ended up in the backyard, the California sun warm on our faces. The garden, my professional canvas and personal sanctuary, was overgrown but alive. "Okay, Ms. Designer," Tom said, handing me a glass of crisp Sauvignon Blanc. "The slate is clean. What's the vision?" I looked at the unruly patch of earth where a sad-looking rosebush had finally given up. My mind, usually buzzing with botanical names and design schemes, felt blissfully empty. Our life was a series of such projects, building and creating, never standing still. "I was thinking a Japanese maple right there," Tom suggested, pointing to the empty space. "For the color." I smiled and shook my head, the wine cool against my lips. "Too predictable, my love. It's what everyone does. What about a smoke bush? A royal purple? For the drama. For the unexpected." He considered it for a moment, then grinned. That was us. He was the steady, thoughtful teacher who grounded us. I was the landscape artist who craved the drama of the smoke bush. He didn't just support my dreams, he co-designed them with me. We talked for hours as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fiery strokes. We talked about the garden, about the business I ran, about the new school year he was about to start. We reminisced about the saffron-robed monks in Luang Prabang and the taste of pho on a bustling Hanoi street corner. Have you ever felt a moment of such perfect contentment that it almost frightens you? That's what I felt right then. A quiet, profound certainty that we had everything we could ever want. Our freedom was our most prized possession, more valuable than any stock portfolio. For my parents, Michael and Susan, the term settling down meant a mortgage, 2 cars, and eventually, a nursery. For Tom and me, it had always meant the opposite. Settling was stagnation. We had a mortgage, yes, but it was a means to an end. A home base, not a cage. Our money went to plane tickets, not baby strollers. Our friends with kids spoke of sleepless nights and PTA meetings with a kind of weary pride. We listened, smiled, and felt a quiet, shared sense of relief. We had made our choice, and we had never, not for 1 second, doubted it. "Where to next?" Tom asked, his voice soft in the growing twilight. "Maybe that 3-month trek in Patagonia? We could rent the house out again to cover most of it." The ease with which he said it sent a thrill through me. This was our rhythm. A big trip, a period of hard work, and then the planning of the next escape. It was a cycle of adventure and creation that fueled us. We were a self-sustaining ecosystem, a closed loop of shared ambition and desire that had no need for outside additions. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the silhouette of the overgrown garden stark against the bruised purple sky. We were 35 and 36, and we were utterly, completely free. Our legacy wouldn't be in a bloodline, it would be in the stories we collected, the beauty we created in soil and stone, and the unconventional love story we were writing for ourselves every single day. We were invincible. We had built a fortress of a life, brick by brick, trip by trip. What we didn't know was that the attack was about to come from the inside. 3 days after our return, we drove to my parents' house for the obligatory welcome home dinner. Have you ever noticed how the homes of your childhood seem to shrink over time? Not this one. This house, the one I'd measured my height against on a doorframe for 17 years, felt as vast and solid as ever. It smelled of my mother's pot roast and my father's quiet authority, a scent so familiar it was practically woven into my DNA. Everything about this place was a monument to stability. The atmosphere was almost theatrically festive. My mother, Susan, fluttered around the kitchen, her cheeks flushed with more than just the heat from the oven. My father, Michael, poured a particularly good bottle of Cabernet, a sign of a special occasion. He was a man who believed in order, in tradition, and in Sunday dinners. He and Tom launched into an easy conversation about school politics, a comfortable rhythm they'd established years ago. I watched them, feeling a sense of deep, settled peace. This was the foundation of my world. We talked about our trip, of course. I described the temples of Angkor Wat, and Tom told a funny story about trying to cross a street in Ho Chi Minh City. My parents listened with the rapt attention of people watching a travel documentary. They were proud of our adventurous spirit, but in a detached way, as if it were a curious hobby, like collecting exotic butterflies. Their lives were rooted here, in this house, in this neighborhood, in a reality that never changed. After dessert, a perfect apple pie, my father cleared his throat. He had a specific way of doing it, a small, percussive sound that commanded attention. The casual chatter immediately ceased. My mother's hand found his on the table, her knuckles white. I exchanged a quick, curious glance with Tom. What was this? A new car? An anniversary trip? My father surveyed the table, a master of ceremonies about to begin the main event. His smile was wide and genuine, yet something in his eyes felt rehearsed. Well, he began, his voice imbued with a self-conscious gravity. Your mother and I have some news. We've made a big decision. He paused for effect. My mother squeezed his hand, her expression a nervous, excited tremor. We've been in this house for almost 40 years. We raised you here, Jenna. We've loved every minute of it. A wave of nostalgia, warm and bittersweet, washed over me. I thought of learning to ride my bike on that driveway, of teenage heartbreaks sobbed into my pillow upstairs. But it's a lot of house for two people, he continued, his tone becoming practical. The yard, the maintenance. We're not getting any younger. My mother nodded in vigorous agreement. So, we decided it was time for a new chapter. As of last week, this house is officially sold. We're moving into one of the new condos over by the lake at the end of the month. The words landed in the quiet dining room with a soft, definitive thud. Sold. A 4-decade-long era, concluded in a single sentence. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Tom was the first to recover. Wow, that's huge news. Congratulations, he said, his surprise genuine. A condo by the lake sounds amazing. I found my voice, echoing him. Mom, Dad, that's incredible. But, so fast? My mother beamed, the relief on her face palpable. It all just fell into place, honey. It felt like a sign. Less work, more time for us. It's a good thing, a really good thing. They were so happy, so utterly convinced of the rightness of their decision, that my own swirl of complicated feelings, the shock, the sudden sense of loss for a place I hadn't lived in for over a decade, felt selfish. This wasn't about me. This was their life, their future. And yet I couldn't shake a tiny, persistent feeling of unease. Why did this celebration feel like a prelude? My father raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he proclaimed. We all clinked glasses, the crystal ringing in the air. But as I looked at my parents' smiling faces, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this wasn't the real announcement. This was just the opening act. My father let the toast hang in the air for a moment, savoring the sound of the ringing crystal. Then he set his glass down with a deliberate click. Have you ever felt the atmosphere in a room shift, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure that signals a storm? That's what happened in my parents' dining room. The warmth from the pot roast and the wine seemed to evaporate, replaced by a charged, expectant silence. He was performing, and we were his captive audience. The sale of the house went better than we could have ever expected, he continued, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the polished mahogany table. He looked from me to Tom, his gaze lingering a moment too long. The market is up, and we got a very, very good price. It's left us with more than enough for the condo and our retirement. And that got us thinking. About legacy. About what really matters. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was not about a condo. This was about something else entirely. He reached down beside his chair and produced a slim, navy blue folder. He slid it across the table. It stopped halfway between Tom and me. The embossed gold lettering on the front was simple. The Jenna and Tom Legacy Fund. It looked like a prospectus for a stock offering. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. A trust fund? Some kind of investment? It felt far too formal, too orchestrated for a simple family dinner. This was the real announcement. This was the reason for the expensive wine. We received a round sum for the house, my father said, his voice dropping to a confidential, businesslike tone. And we want to invest it in your future. He tapped the folder. Open it. I looked at Tom, who gave a slight, bewildered shrug. I reached out, my fingers hesitating before I pulled the folder toward me. Inside was a single, professionally printed page behind a plastic cover. It was a summary of a financial proposal, and at the bottom of the page was a number that made the air rush from my lungs. "We want to pay off your mortgage," my dad said, his voice brimming with pride. "The entire remaining balance, $452,000, a gift, no strings attached." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. $452,000. The number was an alien concept, a string of words that didn't belong in our lives. It was the weight we carried every single day, the single biggest anchor that kept our dreams of more travel, more freedom, just slightly out of reach. To have it gone, it was like being told you could suddenly fly. I looked at Tom. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes fixed on the number on the page. And then my mother spoke. Her voice was thick with emotion, trembling with what I initially thought was the joy of giving. "We'll do this," she said, placing her hand over my father's. "We'll transfer the money, pay off the entire thing, as soon as you two decide to settle down and start a family." The room tilted. The friendly, familiar faces of my parents morphed into something I didn't recognize. The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. "We want our grandchild," she finished, her voice breaking, "to grow up in a home that fully belongs to their parents, a home that's safe and secure." Did you feel that? That was the sound of a gift becoming an invoice. The shock in my system instantly curdled into a cold, creeping horror. This wasn't a gift. This was a transaction. It was a purchase order. They had put a price tag on the single most personal, fundamental decision of my life, and that price was $452,000. I stared at the folder on the table. The legacy fund. The name was a cruel joke. Their legacy wasn't a fund, it was the grandchild they were trying to buy. My father, completely misreading our stunned silence as overwhelmed gratitude, pressed on. "Think about it," he said, his voice full of salesman's charm. "No more mortgage payments. Think of the financial freedom. All that money you could put toward, well, everything else." He was using our own language, our own cherished values, against us. He was selling us a gilded cage, dangling the key, the very freedom we'd built our lives around, as the bait to get us inside. He smiled, a benevolent king bestowing a great treasure upon his children. My mother's eyes were wet with tears, convinced this was the most beautiful, loving gesture in the world. They were looking at us, waiting for the joyful, tearful acceptance they had so clearly rehearsed in their minds. I looked at Tom, desperate for an anchor in the sudden storm, but he was still staring at the folder, his expression unreadable. The dining room, once filled with the warmth of family, had become a boardroom, and my life was the subject of a hostile takeover. The silence in the car was a physical thing. It was heavier than the air, thicker than the darkness outside the windows. The 10-mile drive from my parents' house to ours felt like a journey across a frozen alien planet. I sat rigid in the passenger seat, replaying my mother's trembling voice, my father's triumphant smile. The navy blue folder was on the back seat, an unexploded bomb. I was waiting for Tom to say something, to erupt with the same volcanic fury that was scalding the inside of my chest. I needed to hear his outrage to validate my own. When he finally spoke, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his voice was dangerously quiet. That was something. That was it. Not unbelievable, not insane, just something. The understatement was a splash of gasoline on my simmering rage. Something? "Tom, that was blackmail," I snapped, the words bursting out of me. That was the most manipulative, coercive, disgusting thing I have ever witnessed. They didn't offer us a gift. They tried to buy a grandchild. They put my body, our life, up for sale. "I know. You're right. It was completely out of line," he agreed, his eyes fixed on the road. The immediate agreement calmed me for a fraction of a second. Of course he agreed. We were Tom and Jenna. We were a team. We saw the world through the same lens. This was an external attack, and the walls of our fortress would hold. We would laugh about this one day, the sheer theatrical audacity of it all. But then he kept talking, and the crack appeared. A hairline fracture, almost invisible, but I felt it down to my bones. "It's wild, though, isn't it?" he said, a strange new tone in his voice. It was a musing tone, the one he used when working through a complex math problem with his students. "I mean, the condition is insane, obviously, but the number itself, $452,000, just gone." He shook his head, a small, slow movement. "Can you even imagine, Jenna? No mortgage. Do you know what that would mean?" His words were hypothetical, but they carried a weight that terrified me. "I don't have to imagine it because it's not real," I said, my voice sharp and cold. "The money doesn't exist without the condition. You can't separate them. They are the same thing. It's a package deal, and the price is our entire life, everything we've built." Why wasn't he getting this? Why was he even entertaining the fantasy? The proposal wasn't a financial one, it was an existential one. To even consider the money was to consider the possibility of capitulation. Of course you're right, he said quickly, as if sensing he'd stepped on a landmine. It's just a staggering amount of money. It's life-changing money. He turned onto our street, the familiar houses blurring past. We could travel even more. I could take that sabbatical year I've always talked about. We could finally build that big studio for you in the backyard without taking out another loan. He was trying to sell the idea back to me using our own dreams. And that was the most insidious part. He wasn't tempted by a baby. He was tempted by the freedom he thought a baby could buy. We pulled into our driveway. The house, our perfect sanctuary, suddenly felt like a crime scene, the site of a future betrayal. The car went silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't the shocked silence of the ride from my parents' house. It was a new, hollow silence, filled with the things he was thinking, and the things I was now afraid of. I looked over at him. His profile was illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the house, at the physical manifestation of the debt he was now dreaming of erasing. And in his eyes, I saw it. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't commitment. It was calculation. He was weighing the cost. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just my parents' fight anymore. The enemy was now inside the gates. Do you know the difference between a battle and a siege? A battle is loud, violent, and often over quickly. But a siege is a quiet, patient war of attrition. You aren't defeated by a single decisive blow. You're defeated by 1,000 days of hunger, by the slow poisoning of the well, by the creeping certainty that there is no hope of rescue. After the disastrous dinner, there was no immediate battle. My parents began a siege. It started a week later with a text message from my mother. It was a picture of a chubby, wrinkled newborn swaddled in a blue blanket, looking vaguely like a tiny, angry Winston Churchill. The caption read, "Brenda from my book club is a grandma. Isn't he just the sweetest little thing?" I stared at the photo, my thumb hovering over the delete button. It was a perfectly innocent message, and it was a weapon. I showed it to Tom. He glanced at it and shrugged. "It's just your mom being your mom, Jenna. You can't get mad at a baby picture." But it wasn't just a picture. It was the first stone cast over our wall. A few days after that, an email from my father appeared in my inbox. The subject line was, "Interesting read." There was no text in the body, just a link. I clicked on it, against my better judgment. The article was titled, "The Unspoken Regret: Why More Professionals Are Choosing Family Later in Life." It was filled with quotes from former high-powered executives who found their true calling in parenthood. It was a subtle, intellectual jab to my mother's emotional uppercut. I deleted the email, but the headline lingered in my mind like a bad taste. This was their strategy, you see. They were brilliant. They never mentioned the money again. The $452,000 became a silent, benevolent ghost in the room. It was the great unspoken promise, the pot of gold at the end of a rainbow they were desperately trying to paint across our sky. By not talking about the condition, they made it impossible to argue against. How could I rage against an article? How could I scream about a picture of a friend's grandbaby? They were just sharing, just loving parents who wanted the best for us. Then they found their way to isolate the weakest link. The phone rang on a Saturday morning. It was my father, and he asked for Tom. "Hey Tom, my boy," I heard him say, his voice booming with false bonhomie. "I know it's last minute, but could I borrow your strongback for a few hours? Your mother and I are trying to move the big credenza, and my back isn't what it used to be." It was the perfect request. Unimpeachable. How could Tom say no? To refuse would be petty and cruel. I watched him grab his keys and I felt a cold dread wash over me. I wasn't just sending my husband to help with furniture. I was sending a diplomat into enemy territory, alone. He came home 4 hours later, smelling faintly of my father's Old Spice aftershave. He was quiet, thoughtful. When I asked him how it went, his answer was vague. "It was fine. We got it moved. Your dad is thinking of taking up golf again." He didn't mention any other conversations. He didn't have to. The silence was the story. A space had been created between us, a small pocket of his day that I was not privy to, and I knew with absolute certainty that it had been filled with my parents' propaganda. They hadn't just moved a credenza, they had worked on moving my husband. The invitations for Tom to come over alone became a regular occurrence. "Tom, could you look at this leaky faucet for me? You're so much handier than your father." "Tom, your mother wants your opinion on paint swatches for the new condo." They were building their own separate alliance with him. They flattered him, they sought his counsel, they treated him like the reasonable, level-headed son they'd always wanted, implicitly framing me as the difficult, stubborn daughter standing in the way of everyone's happiness. They were systematically dismantling our united front. I could feel him drifting. The easy intimacy we'd shared, the shorthand of a decade of shared dreams, was being replaced by a careful politeness. The Patagonia trek was no longer mentioned. The smoke bush for the garden was forgotten. One night, I found him staring at the navy blue folder, still sitting on the corner of my desk. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it, the way a man dying of thirst might look at a glass of water he's been told is poisoned. The siege was working. The well was tainted. And I realized I wasn't just fighting for my life. I was fighting for his. The breaking point didn't come with a shout. It came with a question, posed on a quiet Tuesday night over the mundane task of paying bills. For weeks, we had been living in a state of polite avoidance, a carefully choreographed dance around the $452,000 elephant in the room. We talked about the weather, his students, my latest client project. Anything but the navy blue folder that sat on my desk like a silent accusation. But the pressure had been building in the pipes of our marriage, and that night, it finally found a crack. Tom was at the kitchen island with his laptop, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. I was chopping vegetables for a salad, the rhythmic thud of the knife on the cutting board the only sound. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound that made me pause. "The mortgage payment went through," he said, not looking at me. It never feels like you're making a dent, you know?" I said nothing. It was a familiar complaint, one we'd made 100 times before. But tonight, it wasn't just a complaint. It was an opening. He swiveled on the stool to face me. His expression was serious, a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that set off every alarm bell in my body. "Jenna," he began, his voice low and even. "We always said no. It's been our default setting for a decade. But have we ever, really, truly, talked about why? Have we ever discussed it, instead of just declaring it?" I put the knife down, my hand suddenly slick with sweat. The question was so reasonable, so logical, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard him say. I stared at him, trying to see the man I'd traveled the world with. The man who had held my hand and agreed that our life was perfect as it was. But his eyes were different. They were clouded with calculation, with the ghosts of conversations he'd had with my father. For him, this was a philosophical debate. For me, it was a seismic shift, the ground cracking open at my feet. It meant the siege had been successful. The enemy's words were no longer outside the walls. They were being spoken from within the command tent. "What do you mean we haven't talked about it?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "We talked about it on our third date. We talked about it before we got married. We've talked about our freedom, our careers, our desire to see the world, not just read about it in books. Our life is the conversation, Tom. Every plane ticket we buy is a sentence in that conversation. He shook his head, a gesture of patronizing patience that made my blood run cold. No, we've stated a conclusion. We've never examined the evidence. We've never asked, what if? And then he said the words I knew were coming, the words my parents had spent weeks planting in the fertile soil of his mind. What if we just tried? People change their minds, Jenna. Life happens. What if we just saw what happened? I felt a wave of nausea. He said it so casually, as if he were suggesting we try a new restaurant. Just try. As if a child was a hobby you could pick up and put down. As if my body was an experiment. As if our entire shared philosophy was a rough draft he now wanted to scrap. The first real ugly fight of our marriage erupted right there in our kitchen. "This isn't you talking," I heard myself say, my voice shaking with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "This is my father. He's in your head, Tom. He's promising you a life without bills, and you're willing to sell me out to get it." He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. "That is not fair. This is about us, about our future. I'm just trying to have an adult conversation, and you're making it into some grand conspiracy." But it wasn't a conversation. It was a capitulation. It was the sound of my husband, my partner, my other half, waving a white flag. He was no longer standing beside me, defending our fortress. He was standing on the wall, looking down at the offer, and wondering if maybe surrender wasn't such a bad option after all. The battle had changed. It was no longer me and Tom against my parents. It was now me against all of them. My parents hadn't attacked the strongest part of our wall. They had been patient. They had found the weakest link. And it was him. Have you ever walked into a fight you were sure you were going to lose, just to get it over with? That's why I called Sarah. My best friend since college, Sarah was a walking, talking, breathing testament to the life my parents wanted for me. She had the husband, the mortgage on a bigger house in a better school district, and the two prerequisite children, a boy and a girl. I needed to hear the sermon from someone my own age. I needed to hear about the unparalleled joys of motherhood, the magical moments that make it all worthwhile. I needed to feel the full weight of the societal norm to see if it would crush me. I met her at a coffee shop, a neutral territory halfway between my world and hers. She was 10 minutes late, arriving in a flurry of apologies and stray crumbs. There was a smear of what I prayed was chocolate on her sleeve, and dark circles under her eyes that her concealer couldn't quite conquer. She looked at my clean linen shirt and my unhurried posture with the wistful gaze of a soldier looking at a civilian. She was a veteran of a war I had refused to enlist in, and her exhaustion was a uniform she couldn't take off. "I am so sorry," she said, slumping into the chair opposite me. "Liam has decided sleep is for the weak, and Maya is protesting the tyranny of pants." I smiled. "It's fine, you're here now. How are you?" "Really?" She took a long, desperate sip of the latte I'd ordered for her. "I'm caffeinated. Let's go with that." There was no glow. There was no serene bliss. There was just a deep, bone-weary fatigue that seemed to emanate from her in waves. I had come expecting a lecture, but the evidence in front of me was telling a very different story. I took a breath and laid it all out. The dinner, the shocking proposal, the fight with Tom, his terrifying question, "What if we just try?" I told her how my parents were working on him, how he was starting to parrot their logic. I confessed my deepest fear. And the worst part is, a tiny piece of me is starting to wonder if they're right. If I'm the crazy one for not wanting what everyone else seems to want. I look at you, and I think, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. I braced myself for the inevitable, for the gentle, chiding speech about how you can never understand the love for a child until you have one. Sarah just stared at me for a long time, her latte forgotten. Then she did something I never expected. She laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a brittle, humorless sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Oh, Jenna," she said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare do this unless you are 1000% sure. Not 99. 1000. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I love my kids so much it physically hurts sometimes. I would throw myself in front of a bus for them without a second thought. But my life is not my own anymore. It is over. The woman I was is gone." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't the sermon I had come for. This was a warning flare, fired from the heart of the battlefield. From the second I wake up to the second I collapse, every thought, every action, every dollar is for them. There is no me left, Jenna. Not really. There are just these tiny, beautiful, ruthless dictators I created. Do not let anyone, not your parents, not Tom, not society, push you into this. Because you're the one who pays the price. Your body, your career, your freedom, your very identity. They don't have to live with the consequences. You do. I looked at my friend, at the fierce, desperate honesty in her tired eyes. She had given me a gift far more valuable than my parents' money. She had given me the truth. She wasn't telling me her choice was a mistake. She was telling me it was a total and complete surrender of self, a sacrifice she had been willing to make. She was simply asking if I was. She wasn't telling me not to have a child. She was telling me what it would cost. And as I sat there, I realized with a profound, soul-deep clarity that it was a price I was unwilling to pay. She had expected to hear about the joys of motherhood. Instead, she heard the truth from a friend on the front lines, a truth that armed her for the battle ahead. Do you know how trust dies? It's not a loud, dramatic death. It's a quiet poisoning. It happens when you realize the person sleeping next to you, the one whose every breath is as familiar as your own, has a secret life. A life where he is planning your future with someone else. I came home from my coffee with Sarah armed with a newfound clarity, ready to fight for my husband. I didn't realize he had already surrendered. The atmosphere in our house for the next few days was a fragile truce. We were polite, careful strangers, moving around the unresolved conflict like it was a piece of broken glass on the floor. I thought my conversation with Sarah had given me the strength to wait, to find the right moment to rebuild our bridge. I felt a surge of confidence, a belief that our decade of love was stronger than my father's checkbook. I was a fool. The betrayal wasn't coming. It was already there. It was hiding in plain sight. It happened on a Friday afternoon. Tom was rushing to get to a late faculty meeting, gathering papers, his mind clearly elsewhere. He came back inside for a file he'd forgotten, leaving his leather briefcase unlatched on the kitchen island. It was a simple, careless act. But have you ever noticed how the biggest disasters are unleashed by the smallest mistakes? A stray paper peeked out, a corner of a spreadsheet. It wasn't the navy blue folder. It was a plain, manila one. Something about it, so official and out of place, made my stomach clench. I told myself not to look. It was his private stuff. But a primal, instinctual fear overrode everything else. I pulled it out. The first page was a spreadsheet, and I didn't need to see a signature to know who had created it. My father's fingerprints were all over the meticulous columns and logical progressions. Projected annual savings. Post-mortgage liquidation. Asset growth scenarios at 5, 10, and 15 years. It was a detailed, seductive financial roadmap to a life of ease, all predicated on the one initial investment. It was a document designed to appeal to Tom's practicality, to his teacher's salary, to the part of him that worried about retirement. It was the weaponization of common sense. But that wasn't the worst of it. I flipped to the next page and the air left my body in a single, silent gasp. It was a floor plan of our house, a cheap copy from the county records. But it had been marked up. There were notes in the margins, dimensions checked, potential changes sketched in. And there, in the space that was my office, my creative sanctuary filled with my drafting table and my books, was the word, handwritten in my father's familiar block letters and circled in red ink. Nursery. It wasn't a question. It was a designation, a plan. When he walked back inside, whistling softly, I was standing there, holding the papers. I didn't have to say a word. The color drained from his face as his eyes went from the floor plan in my hand to my face. The cheerful, distracted man from a moment ago vanished, replaced by a trapped animal. "What is this, Tom?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. He swallowed, unable to look me in the eye. "Jenna, it's not what it looks like." It's the oldest lie in the book, isn't it? The pathetic, desperate shield of the guilty. He confessed it all then, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pathetic justifications. He'd been meeting with my father, just a couple of times, for coffee. My dad had just wanted to show him the numbers, to explain the full potential of the gift. He was just being a father, Jenna. He was showing me what was possible for us, for our future. But I just held up the floor plan. And was this part of the financial planning, Tom? Were you two designing my future while I was at work? Did you pick out paint colors, too? The sound of his voice faded into a dull roar in my ears as I looked at the man I thought I knew. This was so much worse than a simple disagreement. This was a conspiracy. He hadn't just considered another life, he had been actively designing it, collaborating with the very person who was trying to dismantle ours. He had sat across a table from my father and planned the conversion of my space into a nursery, all without my knowledge, without my consent. He had made me a stranger in my own home, a footnote in the plan for my own life. This was no longer a disagreement. This was a betrayal of the highest order. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like death, that our marriage might not survive it. Have you ever had a moment where you look at your own life and don't recognize it? When the home you built feels like a stranger's house, and the person you love looks like an enemy? That's what I felt standing in my kitchen, holding the blueprints to my own betrayal. The air was thick with the poison of his confession. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. There was only a primal, overwhelming need to escape, to put distance between myself and the wreckage of our marriage. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I moved with a strange, robotic calm, walking past him as if he were a piece of furniture. I went upstairs to our bedroom. No, my bedroom now, and pulled a duffel bag from the top of the closet. I started throwing things in. A few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, my laptop. Every object I touched felt alien, like an artifact from a different life. Tom followed me, his voice a desperate, pleading murmur behind me. "Jenna, please, don't do this. We can talk about this. Let's just talk." I turned to face him, the duffel bag in my hand. "Talk?" I said, the word coming out flat and dead. "We're done talking, Tom. You've been having plenty of talks behind my back. You and my father have been very busy planning my future. I feel like I should leave you two to it." His face crumpled. It wasn't like that. I was confused. He was putting so much pressure on me. But all his excuses sounded like the buzzing of a fly. The details didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the cold, hard fact of his deception. I drove until the city lights were a faint glow in my rearview mirror and checked into the first anonymous roadside hotel I could find. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a perfectly sterile environment for a life that had just been stripped down to its studs. I sat on the edge of the stiff polyester bedspread and felt nothing. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, gray ash of emptiness. What do you do when the person you trusted most in the world proves you were wrong? Who do you even trust after that? For 2 days, I existed in that room. I didn't answer his calls or his barrage of frantic text messages. I needed the silence. I needed to hear my own thoughts without the filter of his voice, his logic, his weakness. I walked through the city, a ghost observing other people's lives. I saw couples holding hands, families laughing in parks, and felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were watching a movie about a language I no longer understood. Was that us? Had we ever been that real? Or had we just been playing roles, unaware that our scripts were completely different? On the third day, I knew I had to make a choice. This limbo was its own kind of hell. I could go back and try to piece things together, or I could walk away for good. The thought of walking away was terrifying, but the thought of going back to a marriage built on a lie was unbearable. I sat on that lumpy hotel bed and finally called him. He picked up on the first ring, his voice raw with sleeplessness and fear. "Jenna. Oh God, Jenna, are you okay?" I didn't let him start with the apologies. I cut straight to the heart of it. "I'm going to say this once, Tom," I said, my voice steady and clear, forged in the silence of the last 48 hours. "This is not about you choosing between me and my parents. I don't care about them right now. This is about you choosing between two different lives. There's the life that they're trying to sell you, the one with no mortgage and a nursery where my office used to be. And then, there's our life. The one we chose together, the one we built, the one with the trips and the freedom and the smoke bush in the backyard." I took a deep breath. This was it. The point of no return. You have to choose which one you want, not which one you think you should want, or which one is easier, but which one you are willing to fight for. Because I can't be in a marriage with a man who is secretly wishing he lived somewhere else. If you can't make that choice, if you can't look me in the eye and tell me that our life is the only one you want, then our we doesn't exist anymore. It's over. I didn't cry. My voice didn't even shake. It was the calmest, most terrifying ultimatum I had ever delivered. And then I hung up. The choice was his. The future was a blank page, and I had just handed him the pen. Do you know what's worse than an ultimatum? The silence that follows. After I hung up the phone, I entered a state of suspended animation. The next 2 days, a stretch of 48 hours that felt like a geologic age, were the purest form of torture I have ever known. Every passing car in the hotel parking lot was him, arriving to end it. Every distant phone ringing was the sound of my life being decided by someone else. I had given him the pen, and now I had to wait to see what story he would write. On the second night, there was a knock on the door. It was a soft, hesitant sound, not the confident knock of a husband coming home. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was him. And the plan was right. He looked utterly devastated. He wasn't the man who had been seduced by a spreadsheet. He was a soldier returning from a war he had barely survived. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale, and his eyes were hollowed out by a profound exhaustion. This wasn't the face of a man coming to negotiate. This was the face of a man who had already burned his own bridges. I opened the door and stepped back, letting him in without a word. The sterile, impersonal hotel room seemed to shrink around him. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the cheap carpet, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the man I had married. Not the calculating, tempted version, but the real Tom. The good, kind man who was now wrestling with a terrible pain. "I did what you said," he said, his voice raspy. I made a choice. And then I went to see your parents. He told me everything. He'd driven to their new, half-unpacked condo, a place filled with the ghosts of their old life and the sterile promise of their new one. He'd sat them down on their plastic-wrapped sofa and told them he needed to be clear. He admitted his own weakness to them first, telling them that their offer was seductive and that for a time he had been blinded by it. He owned his part in the betrayal. He told them he had allowed their dream for my life to cloud his commitment to the life we had actually built. He had taken responsibility. Then came the hard part. I told them that you and I had talked and that we had made our final permanent decision, he recounted, his eyes never leaving mine. I told them we were not going to have children, not now, not ever, and that we needed them to respect that and to never, ever bring it up again. He took a shaky breath. And then I told them we would not be accepting their money, that our mortgage was our problem, and that the price they were asking for their gift was a price we were unwilling to pay. I gave them back the folder. He described the fallout, the shock on my mother's face turning to tears, my father's benevolent mask crumbling to reveal a cold, hard fury. They accused him of being brainwashed, of turning me against them, of being selfish and ungrateful. They had thrown our own dreams back in his face, calling our travels a childish escape from responsibility. But he hadn't wavered. He had just stood up, told them he loved them but that his loyalty was to me and to the life we had chosen, and he had walked out. He finally crossed the small space between us, his hands finding mine. They were trembling. I saw the life they were selling, Jenna, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. For a minute, I wanted it, the ease of it. But it's not our life. It's a cheap copy. I don't want the nursery. I want your office. I want the chaos and the uncertainty and the freedom. I choose the mess. I choose the mortgage. I choose Patagonia. I choose you. And in the wreckage of that ugly hotel room, surrounded by the debris of our broken trust, he had finally chosen us. The war with my parents was about to begin, but the civil war inside my marriage was over. Every victory has a price. We had won our marriage back from the brink, but the invoice was about to arrive. We drove home from the hotel in a silence that was entirely different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't the angry, brittle silence of betrayal, nor the hollow silence of despair. It was a fragile, tender silence, the kind you use around something that has been broken and painstakingly glued back together. We knew the cracks were still there, but we were holding it carefully, hoping it would hold. The phone call that severed a lifetime came on a Sunday morning. It was my mother. I saw her name on the screen and handed the phone to Tom, a silent acknowledgement that he had been the one to face them last. He put it on speaker, a gesture of complete transparency that meant more than any apology. Her voice, stripped of all its usual warmth, was a shard of ice in my ear. "I hope you're happy, Jenna," she began. This wasn't a conversation, it was a sentencing. "Your father and I have never been so insulted in our lives," she continued, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "To have our gift, our love, thrown back in our faces. And you," she said, her venom now directed squarely at Tom, "you manipulated her. You turned our daughter against us with your selfish ideas about freedom. You poisoned her mind." Tom started to speak, to defend himself, but she cut him off. "We are done. Since you two clearly don't need our money, we've decided to donate the entire sum to the university's art fund. At least someone will be grateful." Then she turned the knife on me. "And you, Jenna, after everything we have done for you, to be so ungrateful. You broke your father's heart." There was a pause. I could hear my father's muffled voice in the background, telling her that was enough. But she had one last thing to say. Don't call us. We'll call you if and when we are ready to speak to you again." Then came the definitive click of the phone disconnecting, a sound that severed not just a call, but a family. The line went dead, and a new, deafening silence filled our home. We didn't say anything for a long time. The finality of it was absolute. We had saved our marriage, but in doing so, we had been orphaned. We were an island now, cut off from the mainland I had always taken for granted. We came back to our house, our sanctuary, but the victory felt hollow, the air thick with the ghosts of the family we had lost. The mortgage was still there, a heavy weight on our shoulders. The cost of our freedom was an isolation so profound, it felt like a physical amputation. We were together, yes, but we were completely, terrifyingly alone. What do you think is the loudest sound in the world? A gunshot? A thunderclap? I'll tell you. It's the silence of a phone that used to ring every single day and now never does. The months that followed my mother's final damning phone call were filled with that silence. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air of our home. It was the ghost of the family I had lost, and it followed me from room to room. But a funny thing happens when you survive a hurricane. You don't stand around staring at the wreckage forever. You start to notice what's still standing, and what was standing, stronger than before, was us. The chasm that had opened between Tom and me was gone, filled in with a new, more resilient kind of trust. It wasn't the naive, untested trust of our early years. This was a weld, ugly in places maybe, but forged in fire and stronger than the original metal. We had seen each other's weakest points, and we had not run away. We became closer than we had ever been. We talked more, not about the big, life-altering decisions, but about the small, quiet things that make up a life. We learned to read the subtle shifts in each other's moods, to anticipate the moments when the ghost of the silence would get too loud for one of us, and to fill it with a shared look, a hand on the arm, a quiet, "I'm here." The temptation of my parents' money had been a poison, but surviving it had become the antidote. We had passed the test, and in doing so, we had become an unbreakable team. One evening, several months later, we were sitting in the backyard. It was the same spot where we had sat the day we returned from Asia, the same sky bruising into a familiar twilight. The air was cool, and the garden I'd been too heartbroken to touch was now thriving, a testament to resilience I was only just beginning to feel myself. I expected the memory of that first night, our naive bliss, to hurt. But it didn't. It just felt like a photograph of two people we used to be. Tom swirled the wine in his glass, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but firm in the dusk. "Maybe we won't pay off the mortgage in a single day. Maybe we never will." He looked at me, a small, confident smile playing on his lips. "But we can do this our way. We can still live our life." He reached into the canvas bag he'd brought outside and pulled out a large, rolled-up sheet of paper. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a floor plan. He unrolled it on the small patio table between us. It was a map of South America, the southern tip of Argentina and Chile. But it was covered in notes, in highlighted routes, in sketches of mountains and glaciers. It was a plan. A detailed 3-month itinerary for the Patagonia trek we had once talked about. "I've been doing the math," he said, his finger tracing a winding path through the Andes. "If we rent the house out again, and I take on some summer tutoring, it's not a fantasy, Jenna. We can do it. Not with their money, with ours." He had taken our dream and turned it into a blueprint, a declaration of independence written in trails and campsites. I looked from the map to his face, and I saw the man I had fallen in love with, fully restored. He was no longer the man tempted by the easy road. He was the man who was ready to climb the mountain with me, no matter how hard it was. He hadn't just chosen me, he was choosing us, over and over again, with every line he had drawn on that map. The silence from my parents was still there. It would probably always be there. But for the first time, its sound was drowned out by the promise of a new adventure. They tell you that time heals all wounds, but that's not quite true, is it? It doesn't heal them. It just turns them into scars. A year had passed since the day my family broke, and the wound was now a pale, thin scar on my heart, a place that ached when the weather changed. A year is a long time. It's 365 days of a phone not ringing. It's a first birthday without a card. A first Thanksgiving spent deliberately on the other side of the world. We were in a small cabin in El Chaltén, Argentina, nestled at the foot of the Andes. The wind was a constant living thing here, a wild song whistling through the gaps in the window frames. Our house back home was in the capable hands of a young couple who paid our mortgage, and we were 2 months into our 3-month journey. We had done it. We had chosen the mountain. Tom was out for the day, hiking a trail to a glacier he'd read about. I was alone, nursing a cup of tea and watching the jagged, impossible peaks of Fitzroy play hide-and-seek with the clouds. A lopsided, battered cardboard box was sitting on the small table. It had followed us across continents, a relic from a mail forwarding service, covered in a constellation of stamps and customs declarations. It had arrived that morning, on my 36th birthday. I had been ignoring it, afraid of what it might be. A final, angry letter? A box of my old childhood things? A symbolic casting off? But the return address was simply my mother's name, written in her familiar, perfect cursive, next to the zip code of their new condo. Finally, my curiosity won. My hands trembled slightly as I cut the tape. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a scarf. It was thick and a little lumpy, made of a coarsely spun wool in a deep, stormy blue. It was undeniably handmade, the kind of project my mother took up when she was stressed, and underneath it was a small, plain white card. There were only 8 words on it, written in that same perfect hand. In the mountains, it's probably cold. Love, Mom. My breath caught in my throat. I ran my fingers over the imperfect stitches, feeling the hours of work, the silent thoughts woven into every loop. I started to cry. It wasn't a loud, wrenching sob, but a quiet, steady stream of tears I hadn't known I was holding back for a full year. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a surrender. There was no, "I'm sorry." No, "I was wrong." But it was a message. It was a mother, unable to say the words, knitting a scarf to keep her daughter warm from 3,000 miles away. It was a tiny, fragile truce flag, waved from across an ocean of silence and hurt. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the possibility of it. I wrapped the scarf around my neck. It smelled faintly of my mother's cedar closet, a ghost of a scent from a life I no longer had. I walked to the window and looked out at the vast, indifferent beauty of the mountains. The wind howled, but the wool was warm against my skin, and in that moment, I finally understood. The legacy my parents had tried to force on me, the house, the money, the bloodline, was a cage. The true legacy, the one Tom and I were building right now, was this. It was the freedom to stand on a different continent, to feel the cold wind, and to know that you had chosen your own path, no matter the cost. It was the freedom to write your own story, one painful, beautiful, imperfect stitch at a time.